Thanks for being here today, everybody. Just getting my technology squared away here. Let's just dive right in. In this presentation, we're going to be better understanding the role that sugar plays in blood sugar metabolism and how it impacts important metabolic processes, including hormone production and the HPA axis. We'll look at some lab testing. We'll compare and contrast diets and intermittent fasting, and we'll explore some natural treatments for blood sugar management. But first, let's start with the rise of sugar consumption globally. So obesity is no longer a problem of the developed world. Every country that has adopted the Western diet, meaning a low-cost, highly processed diet, has rising rates of obesity and related disease. In 2010, the UN declared that for the first time in human history, chronic non-communicable diseases pose a greater health burden worldwide than do infectious diseases. So there are now 30% more people worldwide who are obese than undernourished. So you can see here on this graph the leading causes of death globally from 2000 in the white circle to 2019, the shaded circle. You can see the increase in ischemic heart disease, stroke, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease as the top three, all very preventable diseases, as well as some of the others here toward the end, such as diabetes. So how do we get here to this place where preventable chronic disease is killing humanity at a greater rate than infectious disease? I'd like to go back to our ancient ancestors to see what they ate. How did they sustain human life for thousands of years? Well, we know that our Cro-Magnon ancestors obtained food from hunting and gathering. Their diet was composed mostly of protein, some fat from meats, fish, and nuts and seeds, and complex carbohydrates from plants, and very occasionally fruit, such as berries and honey. But because sugar was only seasonally and infrequently available, or it was guarded by bees, it was rarely consumed. Fast forward to the standard American diet of today. Weston Price was a Canadian dentist who noticed increasing amounts of tooth decay and overcrowding in his dental patients in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He theorized that the modern diet of refined food and sugar was the culprit, and so he set about on traveling around the world to meet groups of people who were untouched by the modern diet. Sure enough, he found beautiful straight teeth, no tooth decay, healthy bodies, and disease resistance in places that were untouched by modern processed food. He continued to follow their health over time, and he found that once industrialized food was introduced to these isolated communities, their dental and physical health degenerated to be on par with those of industrialized countries. So let's take a quick history lesson on sugar. Aside from fruit, honey was the predominant sweetener worldwide until sugar was extracted from sugarcane for the first time in the 11th century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the refinement of sugarcane and beets came along, and so much so that in England, sugar consumption increased by 1,500% between the 18th and 19th centuries. By the end of the 20th century, it was a major constituent of human diet around the world. And today, sugar from beets is the most commonly found commercial sweetener, aside from high fructose corn syrup. So let's break down some important historical events that contributed to the obesity epidemic that we face today. Here's another little history lesson about the sugar industry. In 1954, the president of the Sugar Research Foundation gave a speech to his profession outlining a business opportunity. If Americans could be persuaded that fat was unhealthy and a low-fat diet was healthier, they would need to replace the fat with something else, which they wanted to be sugar. So in the 1960s, that organization funded a literature review that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, pointing the finger at fat to deflect attention away from the previous papers that suggested that sugar played a role in coronary artery disease. The literature review refuted the entire body of scientific research up to that point, and it pointed to the association between sugar and coronary artery disease, suggesting that cutting fat out of the diet was the best way to prevent CAD. Also during the 60s, the food industry developed technology to extract sugar from corn, hydrolyze it into glucose, and convert part of the glucose into fructose, which resulted in corn-derived sweeteners such as high fructose corn syrup. It had many properties that made it a desirable addition to processed foods, such as a very high sweetness, a long shelf life, the ability to maintain moisture in bakery products, and it was low cost. Many of you will remember the ridiculous FDA food pyramids from childhood. This is from 1992. It's easy to see how the industry influenced these food recommendations and how this is also likely contributing to the obesity epidemic today. I have memories of being a child and being stressed out about how I was going to get my 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta into my diet on a daily basis. So a quick review of sugar. Carbohydrates are the preferred energy source for the body because they contain glucose. They're made up of and broken down into the simple sugars glucose, fructose, and to a lesser degree, galactose. All carbohydrates, whether simple or complex polysaccharides, are ultimately broken down into these sugars. The polysaccharides also contain fiber, which amounts to a lower release of glucose into the bloodstream, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. These are glucose and fructose molecules at the top, the monosaccharides, and sugar is a disaccharide. It's made up of a glucose and a sucrose. Sorry, it's made up of a glucose and a fructose molecule joined by a glycosidic bond. The human body is designed to get most of its energy from small amounts of glucose, less from fructose, and even smaller amounts from sucrose. What you're seeing here is how the polysaccharides in fruit are broken down into glucose, fructose, and sucrose. Note that the fruits that contain the highest amounts of total sugar are only about 15 to 18 grams of total sugar per 100 grams of serving. Hang on to this picture of the lower sugar content in fruit because we're going to be talking a lot more about fructose in the coming slides. The point is that the total sugar and total fructose content in whole foods is very low compared to that in processed foods. And so here we highlighted grapes at 18.1 total sugars and banana 15.6. When sugar comes with its inherent fiber in whole fruit, up to 30% of the sugar will be absorbed by the microbes of the gut, contributing to microbial biodiversity, and it removes it from the blood glucose equation. Again, fiber contributes to a slower rise in blood sugar, and an orange still has its fiber and a much lower sugar content than if you're looking at orange juice that has very little fiber and a high sugar content, which is going to contribute to a rapid blood sugar spike and fall. And of course, 16 ounces of orange soda is going to do the same, as opposed to the medium orange, which is going to have a slow, controlled rise in blood sugar. Next two slides point out the differences in the metabolism of glucose and fructose. So when you think of glucose, think fuel. Because glucose is the preferred substrate for energy metabolism, every cell in the body possesses a glucose transporter to move glucose into the cell. When you eat 120 kcals of glucose, such as in a simple carbohydrate food like white bread, the plasma glucose levels rise and insulin is released by the pancreas. But only 80% of that glucose bolus is immediately utilized by muscle, brain, heart, and other cells, and only about 20% enters the liver. When you think of fructose, think storage. Orange juice is an example of a high sucrose food. As we know, sucrose is a disaccharide. 120 kcals of sucrose contain about 60 kcals each of fructose and glucose. Most of that fructose will reach the liver, along with about 20% of the glucose. Because of that high level of fructose, the liver must handle triple the substrate that it did for glucose alone. And this is fine for occasional ingestion of fructose from natural sources, but not for regular use. So this is a very oversimplified depiction of how fructose goes directly to the liver and is stored as fat and glycogen, whereas glucose, 80% of it is utilized by the cells of the body, and only a small portion, about 20%, makes it to the liver to be stored as fat and glycogen. So from an evolutionary perspective, the foods with high fructose levels are sweet to ensure that they are overindulged in, to enable fat storage for survival through lean times like the winter. Whether or not it enters the liver plays an important role in obesity. Here's a historical graph of the average per capita calories of US food consumption. Note that vegetables, fruit, dairy, meat, eggs, and nuts have remained quite constant over time. And they are really not the culprits in the obesity epidemic. But look at the increase in flour and cereal products, added fats, and added sugars on top of the natural food consumption. This is a graph showing 5-year increments of fructose-containing sweeteners from 1970 to the present. You can see how sucrose in red drops off between 1979 and 85, where it was largely replaced by high fructose corn syrup in blue. And this is total sugar up the top in purple. And let's not forget exploding beverage sizes from 1988 to 2003, the supersized soft drinks in green versus the 1950s when the only size available was 7 ounces. Note that McDonald's drinks have grown 457% since 1955, have grown in size 457% since 1955, even with the discontinuation of the supersized drinks. And this graph shows the prevalence of obesity among US adults from 1960 to 2010 and projected into 2030 based on population trends. Note how this upward trend in obesity from 1984 to 2000 shadows the rise of high fructose corn syrup and the increasing beverage sizes. Jury is still out on the complicated and controversial topic of whether sugar promotes dependence or even addiction. So let's break this down a little bit further. This is the glycemic index. It's a ranking of carbohydrates on a scale from 0 to 100 based on how quickly 50 grams of carbohydrates cause an increase in blood sugar levels or glucose levels after eating. So for reference, pure glucose has a GI of 100. Foods with a low GI have more fiber and fat, so it leads to a slower rise in blood sugar. Note that the foods with the lowest GI, less than 55, are the vegetables, some dairy products, most fruits, legumes, and nuts, which unfortunately are not on this chart. And then finally, grains and starches have the highest GI. We perform at our best when our blood sugar is kept relatively constant by eating low glycemic index foods, again, fats, proteins, and polysaccharides. If it goes too high too quick, with simple carbohydrates, the brain signals the pancreas to secrete insulin quickly, which then brings blood sugar down quickly by converting the excess sugar to stored fat, which creates a sensation of a crash. And let's not forget the important impact that alcohol can have on blood sugar. This is a calculator that I found online where you can compare the calories in an alcoholic beverage to the calories in a cheeseburger, and then the number of minutes of exercise that it would take to burn off those calories. On the left, I did a glass of wine, 175 mils, approximately 6 ounces, and how that compares to half a cheeseburger and about 16 minutes of running. And on the right is 25 mils or half a shot of a spirit, which is about 20% of a cheeseburger and 6 minutes to run that off. So remember that alcohol is a sugary beverage and it is often consumed on top of what one is eating. One of the quickest paths to weight loss is cutting out alcohol by half or altogether. Leptin and ghrelin are the 2 important hormones in appetite regulation. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone that's produced in the stomach when it's empty. It stimulates feeding and appetite, and then when food is consumed in moderate amounts, the ghrelin production is suppressed, giving the brain the signal to stop producing ghrelin and stop eating. And so you can see here that this is just a breakout from the hypothalamic arcuate nucleus where the signal from the ghrelin goes when the stomach is empty. So high fructose corn syrup does not suppress ghrelin the way that glucose does. So the levels remain elevated and the feeling of hunger persists, leading to overconsumption. Leptin primarily comes from adipose cells. and it decreases appetite and it triggers satiety. Chronic high fructose corn syrup consumption triggers leptin resistance. So the signal of the satiation doesn't take place, and it leads to a perpetual overconsumption. In other words, high fructose corn syrup hijacks the system of appetite and satiety, and it can lead to perpetual overconsumption. So do these mixed signals contribute to overconsumption? These two signals, these mixed signals, can they contribute to addiction or dependence? Well, in the next 3 slides, we're going to talk about 3 possible mechanisms for food addiction or dependence. And we're going to consider if food can serve as a substance of addiction the way that drugs and alcohol can. This 2018 literature review found that rapid shifts in blood insulin and glucose levels from high GI foods impact the dopamine response system, or the limbic system, similar to addictive substances. So like substances of addiction, anticipating sugar can elicit a dopamine surge. But then following the consumption of these foods, there is a blunted dopamine response, which results in food seeking to actualize that anticipated dopamine surge, which creates a cycle of craving and food seeking behavior. Another perspective is the shared genetic vulnerability theory, which posits that many people with a high BMI also have a dopamine receptor polymorphism, which is associated also with cocaine, alcohol, and opioid use. So this association suggests that the polymorphism makes one more sensitive to changes in dopamine levels, which may render one more susceptible to seek out addictive substances, including from food. Other researchers have argued that high trigger foods with a high GI and high fat content contribute to a behavioral addiction, analogous to a gambling disorder. Behavioral addictions are thought to be mediated by a Pavlovian conditioning and habit-forming response, and it's also modulated by the mesolimbic reward system, manifesting in symptoms of cravings, impaired control over behavior, tolerance, withdrawal, and high rates of relapse. So we've got these 3 theories. Food addiction, related to the rapid increase in blood glucose levels, leading to dopamine surges and subsequent dopamine receptor blunting. The shared genetic vulnerability related to dopamine receptor activity, and behavioral addiction, which is related to the dopamine reward system. I included here the DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorder from 2018. A patient must fulfill at least 2 of these 11 criteria to be considered on the spectrum. So when you might want to take a look at this when you're considering where some of your patients might fall on this spectrum. I've always heard the rumor that American processed food supply is loaded with more sugar and unhealthy ingredients than what's available in other parts of the world, but I never saw the side-by-side comparisons. Well, here you can see on the left the comparison of ketchup from the UK and US, and on the right, Quaker strawberry instant oats. All I have to do is glance at the lengthy ingredients on the right, the American version versus the UK version, many fewer ingredients, to be able to see the differences. Net carbs is a tenet that's been used in the diabetes world for years. It's the concept that fiber slows the total carbohydrate load, it prevents an insulin spike, and it's less stress on the pancreas and insulin receptors. So these are packages of Trader Joe's items right from my pantry. Not very good pictures, so I apologize for that. On the left are Parmesan cheese bites, less than 1 gram of carbs and no fiber, just fat. In the middle are keto fudgy bites, 8 grams of carbohydrates, 6 grams of fiber, so 2 grams of net carbs. And on the right is gluten-free mac cheese, 51 grams of carbohydrates and 0 fiber for a whopping 51 grams of net carbs. Perhaps the answer is to eat more foods that don't come with a food label. So shop the perimeter of the grocery store for lower net carbs, and whole foods in general are going to have lower net carbs, whole unprocessed foods. So please know that when I'm talking about metabolic syndrome, the intention is not to single out obesity as the cause of metabolic syndrome, but to think of it as a marker or a symptom of metabolic dysfunction that is occurring worldwide. Metabolic syndrome was first called Syndrome X in 1988, and since then, various health organizations have established their own criteria. The most recent harmonized criteria from a joint statement by several different health organizations claims that one has metabolic syndrome when they have at least 3 of the 5 findings here. The internet, and so this can be a great road for deciding what you're going to test in your patients. So fasting serum glucose of greater than 100, blood pressure greater than 130/85, serum triglycerides greater than 150, serum HDL less than 40, and a waist circumference of approximately greater than 40 inches in men or 35 inches in women. And they specified 35 inches in Asian Americans and 32 inches in Asian Americans. Now, of course, we're Asian American women. Of course, we're starting to rethink this as we're becoming more aware of different body types, but this is their harmonized statement. And I actually like to use it more to guide toward the testing that I want to do with my patients. Someone might ask, can you live with obesity and not have metabolic syndrome? And the answer is no, because of how metabolically active adipose tissue is. As a result of having metabolic syndrome, one has a 2x risk for cardiovascular death, a 3x risk for cardiovascular complications, and a 5x risk for type 2 diabetes. So here at the tail end of the pandemic, we have a good sense for the risk factors that are associated with COVID-19, obesity being at the top of the list. Why? Well, because adipocytes activate the inflammatory cascade, increasing the risk for thromboembolism and cytokine storm. Specifically, obesity negatively impacts lung mechanics, such as lung epithelial mitochondria, and it puts people with obesity at a greater risk for respiratory diseases, lung injury, and lung failure. This is a meta-analysis that was published during the pandemic in 2020. It included more than 77,000 hospitalized COVID-19 patients from around the world, suggesting that in those who died of COVID-19, they had the following pre-existing, largely preventable conditions. 36% had hypertension, 19% had diabetes, 33% had obesity, 12% had coronary artery disease, 10% had heart failure, and 11% were smokers. So up until very recently, the generally agreed upon theory of hyperinsulinemia was that of the middle graphic, or what we call the starvation paradigm, suggesting that glucose can't get into the cell because the cell's receptors are resistant to insulin, or that they're faulty or disordered. The overflow paradigm on the far right suggests that there's nothing wrong with the cell or the receptors. It's just that it's overflooded, it's overfull. The tank needs to be emptied to enable the receptors and the tank to work properly again, like this graphic on the far left, which is a healthy functioning glucose receptor and cell. So we're going to talk specifically about how to empty the tank in the diet and fasting section. Make sure you know the difference between visceral and subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous, you can pinch with your fingers right around your belt line, and visceral is distended fat because the fat is literally packed around the organs and it causes the belly to distend. And this is the metabolically active fat. Next 2 slides outline as simply as possible how insulin and adipose tissue impacts hormones. Sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG, is the protein that is bound to and transports testosterone, DHT, and estradiol in the serum. Spikes in insulin impair sex hormone binding globulin and thus the normal hormone cascade in men and women. So in men, insulin spikes increase sex hormone binding globulin, leading to a decrease in androgens. In women, insulin spikes decrease sex hormone binding globulin, leading to an increase in androgens. Here's another way to look at it. Belly fat contains high quantities of the hormone aromatase, which converts testosterone into estradiol in men and women. And in women, insulin spikes are going to decrease sex hormone binding globulin, leading to an increase in androgens. And in men, insulin spikes increase sex hormone binding globulin, and bind up those androgens, leading to lower levels. A 2013 study on 74 men between the ages of 19 and 34 found that 75 grams of glucose was associated with a 25% decrease in their mean testosterone levels, regardless of their glucose tolerance or their BMI. And those levels remained suppressed, those testosterone levels remained suppressed for 120 minutes. The authors concluded that testosterone levels were at their highest during fasting states, particularly in the morning. So you can see how regular sugar consumption can add up to perpetually suppressed testosterone levels in men. And this bottom bullet here shows you foods that are easy 75 glucose hits that could decrease one's testosterone levels potentially for the whole day. Potatoes, white bread, rice cakes, milk, most crackers, bagels, cakes, donuts, croissants, most packaged breakfast cereals, soft drinks, sodas, and beer. Well, not all of these are going to be consumed in the morning, but many of these are breakfast foods. So it's just setting one off for low testosterone levels all day. The study found that men in the lowest tertile of free testosterone levels are at a 4x risk of diabetes over men in the highest tertile. And they also found that low sex hormone binding globulin is associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. Let's see, is that correct? Yes. PCOS is the metabolic syndrome of women of childbearing age under 45. It affects 4 to 12% of women of reproductive age. It's a leading cause of infertility. 80% of women with PCOS have an average or above average or high BMI, insulin resistance, and the topical PCOS symptoms of ovarian cysts, male pattern baldness, acne, and hirsutism. They also experience increased inflammation and cardiovascular impairment and cardiovascular disease. The chart shows how hyperinsulinemia, hyperandrogenemia, insulin resistance, and genes all interconnect in women. You might find it helpful to refer to this chart as you learn more about PCOS and metabolic syndrome. And you can see here on the right the symptoms that women with PCOS often experience: hirsutism, menstrual irregularity, and reduced fertility. And on the left here, hypertension and dyslipidemia. So many providers will say to us, my patient is not overweight, so they don't suspect PCOS in these patients. It's important to be aware of the signs and symptoms because approximately 20% of women with PCOS have a normal or low BMI. They may not have insulin resistance, and they may not have typical symptoms of PCOS that take place during puberty, such as acne, oligomenorrhea, and hirsutism. The prevalence of insulin resistance is only 6 to 22% in these phenotypically thin women. Some have normal BMI, but an increased waist-hip ratio. So that's that apple body, that apple physique. And their body fat may even be lower in this population compared to weight-matched controls, especially in the legs. And compared to a woman with a more pear-shaped body where she has more weight below her waist, she's less of a concern than somebody who has the majority of her weight here in the middle. And that's that visceral fat that we were talking about. But keep in mind that women with lean PCOS have higher levels of insulin, VLDL, LDL, plasma viscosity, and pro-inflammatory cytokines compared to age-matched controls, and lower HDL. According to the criteria that was established in 2004, the Rotterdam criteria, a diagnosis of PCOS can be made when at least 2 of these 3 criteria are met. So we're looking at anovulation and regular periods, presence of polycystic ovaries on ultrasound examination, or the presence of clinical or biochemical hyperandrogenemia. So oftentimes we will not see the cysts on ultrasound, but we will see the irregular menses and some of these hyperandrogen symptoms. What does stress have to do with blood sugar? When you are in fight or flight mode, glucose is released by the liver to give muscles the energy that they need to escape danger. Because there is no physiological need for this extra glucose and you're not actively running and your muscles don't need that glucose, those increased levels very quickly crash to keep blood sugar, the insulin levels are released when there's a really quick release of glucose. And then there's a crash, takes place about 30 to 60 minutes later. And keep in mind, because modern threats are more mental and emotional than physical, that this process can repeat itself over and over throughout the day, creating these dangerous insulin spikes. This curve shows what happens to cortisol as a result of a high glycemic meal. So it's the same kind of concept here, where so that there's a rise in blood sugar level as a result of adrenal stress, and that sugar spike. So that sugar spike, that rise in blood sugar levels, causes the body to overreact with large amounts of insulin, which lead to a sugar crash. And those symptoms could be fatigue, stress response, and hunger. So if one is experiencing a lot of stress in their day, and they're going to be experiencing insulin spikes from that, as well as a diet high in simple carbohydrates and sugars. Not surprisingly, those who have type 2 diabetes have higher cortisol and blood glucose levels at 10 p.m. compared to controls, and they report higher chronic stress and an exaggerated stress response. So this could also be true for your female patients with PCOS and all patients with metabolic syndrome. So screen for blood sugar imbalance and look at their HPA axis function. This research outlines the bidirectional link between stress, insulin resistance, and depression, citing that depression is associated with an increased risk for progressive insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. It's also associated with a blunted cortisol awakening response and a flattening of the diurnal curve, which is associated with increased cardiometabolic risk and is often seen in diabetes. So we're going to see some pictures of that in a couple slides. So oftentimes the very first sign of PCOS in a woman is elevated androgens, and we'll often see them on our hormone saliva tests. So on this test, you can clearly see that both testosterone and DHEA are elevated. Sometimes one or the other is elevated and sometimes both. In men, low-range testosterone and DHEA can be a warning sign of insulin resistance. So even though he's showing up as being within the range is 30 to 150 and he's at 37. So he's at the low range of testosterone and his DHEA levels are frank low. And these are typical pictures of cortisol levels over time with chronic stress. On the far left is chronic stress associated with sex hormone binding globulin variations and depressions. On the in the middle and the right, you see the blunting and flattening of cortisol curves that we see with depression, as we were looking at that slide previously, and often seen in type 2 diabetes, and also in increased associated with increased cardiometabolic risk. This is our new hormone and urinary metabolite assessment profile, or HUMAP, and this is a nice way to take a quick look as well at what's going on with one's hormones, and to get a quick peek of whether or not one is looking at metabolic syndrome. This is a 59-year-old male, and this is the cholesterol cascade. Oh, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. And you can see that his testosterone levels are blue, which is low. And you can see down below here that this is the range. Dark blue is low, light blue, low range. Green is the functional zone, optimal zone. Yellow is upper range and red is high. So in the case of this gentleman, he is running low range to low androgens. Specifically, testosterone is low and DHT is low range. And then here we have our depiction of a 35-year-old woman with PCOS. And basically we're seeing an opposite picture than we saw in the man with low testosterone, in terms of testosterone being elevated, as well as 5-DHT, which can be the cause of some of those hyperandrogen symptoms that she's having. And I didn't point out below that there's some ratio and calculations here where you can look at the total of DHEA plus DHES. And in this woman, she's running elevated. And in the previous gentleman, he was running, he was within range, running a little more toward the lower range. And you can also take a look at 5-alpha reductase activity, as well as testosterone and epitestosterone in these relationships, these ratio and calculations at the bottom. This is a list of lab tests for metabolic syndrome that come from the harmonized criteria so that you know what to test in your patients. And here are some additional tests that are not included in that criteria, but are also important considerations for metabolic syndrome that you might consider. We've already looked at the salivary estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, and DHEA, as well as our HUMAP metabolism testing of testosterone and DHEA. Fasting insulin, vitamin D, hemoglobin A1C, a VAP, clotting factors, C-reactive protein, homocysteine, and calcium scores. As humans, we live by cycles, yearly, seasonal, monthly, 24-hour cycles. 80% of our genes in the body are on a 24-hour cycle. So when they're high or low at the wrong time of day, as a result of a disrupted circadian rhythm, there are negative health effects. Light and darkness are the main ways to train this rhythm, but the second most powerful timekeeper, or a Zeitgeber, is food timing. Fasting and intermittent fasting have been utilized by many cultures and religions throughout history. And recently, there's been a growing body of scientific research in the last 10 to 15 years or so that's focused on intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, which is basically the same thing. So I'm going to be using them interchangeably for the rest of this presentation. Intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, and time-restricted feeding are all basically the same thing, so TRE or TRF. The main idea is how to reap the greatest benefits from that overnight fast by consuming one's calories within a certain window during waking hours. Here's a representation of some of the scientifically documented physiological processes that are directly related to the daily circadian rhythm. So you can see how confining one's eating to a certain period in the daytime, so this is a 24-hour day, and this is daytime here with 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. So you can see how when one's confining one's eating to a certain period during waking hours makes sense, and it will help to prolong that physiological benefits of that overnight fast. So you can see what some of those benefits are here. Peak neutrophil levels, peak lymphocyte levels. And here's a summary of various diseases and metabolic risk factors that have been shown to respond favorably to fasting and or time-restricted feeding in animal models and or in humans. So the green portion of the wheel represents the eating window, and the gray portion represents the fasting window. So this is from the Manoogian research, which we're going to be looking at a little bit more later. So it's pretty impressive when you see what the research has shown that's been responsive to different kinds of fasting. Time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. Alzheimer's, stroke, breast cancer risk. I'm just going to point out a few here. PCOS, and over here on the left, glucose tolerance, intolerance, obesity, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes, and even gestational diabetes and metabolic syndrome have all been shown to be responsive to these intermittent fasting periods. We're going to be talking more about these in the upcoming slides, but I recommend that you take a look at this and become more familiar with it. So what we're learning from this new literature is that when you eat may be equally or even more important than what you eat. So I'm going to say that again. When you eat may be equally or even more important than what you eat. So why? Well, blood sugar and insulin increases. So with this caveat, it has more so with simpler carbs and less so with complex carbs and protein. So those simple sugars obviously are going to cause those increases in blood sugar and insulin, whereas complex carbs, protein, and then fat has the lowest impact on glucose and insulin. When you don't eat, or if you simply extend that overnight fasted state, it helps to boost autophagy, which is when cells are breaking down other harmful cells. It reduces insulin levels, it increases fat burning, and promotes ketone production. So regardless of what you eat, it's this overnight fast or increasing that fast is going to maximize these metabolic effects. This is a landmark study from 2012 in mice that showed the benefits of an 8-hour feeding window. There were 4 groups of mice. There was a group that the first group ate a normal mouse diet ad libitum, so and whenever they wanted in a 24-hour period. There was the second group that ate the mouse diet in an 8-hour period. There was a third group that ate a high-fat diet ad libitum, so anytime in the 24-hour period, and a fourth group that ate a high-fat diet only during a time-restricted eating window, which was 8 hours during the day, and they could eat as much as they wanted. They found that the high-fat and the mouse chow diet that was confined to the 8-hour period maintained or lost weight, and that they found that the mice that ate a high-fat diet or a normal mouse chow diet around the clock gained weight, became obese, and became sick. So what they concluded was that the fasting window, or the feeding window needs to fall in the active part of the day. So either early or early, middle, late, or even later in the day, but not during the night when one should be sleeping. So it wasn't so much about what the mice ate, it was when they ate it. And so since then, human studies have replicated this. So the top study is the Gable study, which is referenced down below. It was an 8-hour time-restricted feeding window, and they provided mild caloric restriction, and they found weight loss and metabolic improvement in obese subjects without having to be so focused on calorie counting. The Sutton, the second one, the Sutton research found that confining that eating window between 9 in the morning and 3 p.m. increased insulin sensitivity and beta cell responsiveness. It decreased blood pressure and oxidative stress and appetite. And they did this for 5 weeks. And then the Hutchison study, they had a feeding window of 8 to 5. There was a decreased mean fasting glucose. And then they also did a TRF, so they also did a 12 to 9 window, and that they found a glycemic response, an improved glycemic response, but they didn't actually have a decrease in the mean fasting glucose. So there is some research that shows that the eating period that begins earlier in the day and ends earlier in the day can have some slightly greater impact, but confining that eating window at any point during the day has positive benefits. And I wanted to, go over that Gable because I wasn't conveying that one correctly. The Gable research was done in obese adults, and they had ad libitum, or they could eat whatever they wanted between 10 and 6 p.m., 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., and they found a decrease in body weight and blood pressure at 12 weeks. And this is research from that same Manoogian that we were looking at before. The left circle shows that the human subjects that had an extended eating window or frequent, or even just frequent changes in their eating window. So if they didn't have a schedule, that they had an increase in obesity and cardiometabolic disease were on the right. A consistent daily schedule and or restricted eating window of less than 12 hours did the opposite, decreased obesity and metabolic disease, and it increased sleep and quality of life. So this is a schematic of ideal time-restricted eating intervention for long-term adherence. And you can just take a look at this. It's basically summarizing what we were just talking about before, but I wanted to point out that ideally that there would be no food consumed 2 to 3 hours before bedtime and no bright light to try to maximize that rise in melatonin that's going to be taking place later in the evening. That one spends 8 hours in bed, and then and for at least one after one wakes, in order to take advantage of that fasting period throughout the night, that one would avoid eating for a good 1 hour plus after they wake up. And then here is the feeding window during this time frame, and also really important to be exposed to light, again, because of the importance of the circadian rhythm. And here's just a little summary that goes over what we were just talking about. And here's a couple examples that you can take a look at that might be helpful for you with your patients to help them start wrap their brains around the time-restricted feeding window. And this is a little app called My Circadian Clock that was designed by one of those researchers from the research papers that I was just citing. And it can help one to keep track of their feeding window, because people tend to think that their eating window is shorter than it actually is. So this is a good way to keep track of that. So let's talk about some treatment, or perhaps a better way to put this is how to empty the tank. So in a meta-analysis of 6 small studies, so only, small, only about 200 participants with a short duration, 5 to 6 months, they found that a low GI diet enabled people with obesity to lose more weight and improve their lipid profiles than with other diets. So even though they were allowed to eat as much as they desired of the approved foods, it wasn't time restricted, but imagine what the effects would have been if it were. And the approved foods were complex carbohydrates and mostly whole food diets. This research compared results of carbohydrate restriction versus a low-fat diet. And they found that the carbohydrate restriction had consistently reduced glucose and insulin, better insulin sensitivity, and more weight loss, as well as decreased adiposity and more favorable triglycerides and cholesterol responses than the low-fat diet. Vitamin D plays an important role in insulin sensitivity, and it's been shown to be more effective than metformin. We know that B6 deficiency has been associated with cancer and diabetes, and diabetic patients have a higher risk of developing tumors. In patients with type 2 diabetes, in this research, supplementing with B6 50 milligrams 3 times a day for 6 weeks decreased hemoglobin A1C levels by 6%. Magnesium has been shown to reduce insulin requirements as well, and also to decrease fasting plasma glucose levels in diabetic and pre-diabetic patients. Alpha lipoic acid has been shown to increase insulin sensitivity in patients with type 2 diabetes, decrease platelet reactivity in patients with type 1 diabetes, and slow the progression of diabetic nephropathy. Green tea has been shown to decrease fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C levels in people with obesity and type 2 diabetes. And this is my favorite liver support, blood sugar balancing, anti-inflammatory herb, berberine. It's been shown to decrease BMI and waist circumference. It has favorable lipid effects. It's hepatoprotective, hypoglycemic, and anti-inflammatory. I will often give this to patients at bedtime to maintain blood glucose levels during sleep, but be careful because it works so well that it can also induce low blood sugar levels, and one of those symptoms could be headache. So perhaps giving it to somebody at bedtime can help to avert that untoward symptom, but just keep that in mind. That's how well berberine works. It's actually considered a glucose clearer and can help to hasten or speedily bring on a fasting state. Gymnema leaves have been shown to regenerate beta cells in the pancreas, leading to increased insulin secretion. It's also been shown to enhance insulin sensitivity, reduce blood sugar levels, and impair the ability to taste sweets. So a tincture can help with sugar cravings. And it was the study dose was 400 milligrams a day. And it can also be dosed throughout the day, and many providers will even dose up to 2,000 milligrams a day to try to help with those cravings. Here are 2 studies on exercise and insulin. The first one is my favorite intervention, period, for blood sugar management. Taking a walk for 10 minutes after each meal provides greater blood sugar control in diabetics than 30 minutes of exercise once a day. And that's been repeated multiple times. There was another one that came out recently that was 15 minutes after eating a meal. The second found an inverse relationship between exercise and diabetes risk, and found that increasing exercise from 150 to 300 minutes per week reduced type 2 diabetes by 36%. This is so attainable for people just to go out and take a walk after they eat. And even if they can't go outside and take a walk, even if they're walking around inside of their apartment or inside of their house for 10 or 15 minutes, or moving in some way, if they have a little mini trampoline in the house, or even doing light calisthenics, very light calisthenics after a meal could also help with this. So I find this concept of afterburn fascinating. So here's how it works. Muscles need more energy during exercise than at rest. The energy comes from the muscle's ability to break down fat and carbohydrates that are stored within the muscle, liver, and fat tissue, and they do this with the help of oxygen. During exercise, we breathe faster and our heart works harder to pump more oxygen to mobilize those carbohydrates to get them to the exercising muscles. After exercise, oxygen uptake remains elevated in order to restore the muscles to their resting state, and it continues to break down stored fat and carbohydrates. So this is known as exercise. It's known as exercise post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. So it's also known as the afterburn effect. High intensity interval training, HIIT, and high intensity resistance training, HIRT, are the most effective activities to elevate both short and long-term afterburn. Longer exercise sessions that use multiple large muscles performed to or near fatigue results in higher and longer lasting afterburn. So not everybody's going to have access to a gym or have access to resistance, but they might be able to use resistance bands to do this. This can help as well. But of course, if not, everyone can take a walk after their meal. So that was a lot of information. Thank you for joining me today. This image is a simple reminder that the foods with the lowest glycemic index and net carbs are the whole fresh foods that require refrigeration that are found on the perimeter of the grocery store, such as fruits and vegetables, dairy products, eggs, and meats. The processed foods are in the boxes, and they are found in the aisles in the middle of the grocery store. So I'm happy to take some questions now.